I know so many fighters that are living in the Jackson's MMA gym because they can't afford to have their own apartment. And they're UFC fighters.
Those 6 fighters are suing the UFC, accusing the UFC of engaging in monopoly and monopsony violations.
You guys know how the UFC contract can be restrictive, and as an independent contractor, you don't really have a say.
The UFC has established itself as the most popular and lucrative organization for mixed martial arts in the world, with the company repeatedly boasting about breaking their financial records year after year. But despite the major surge in popularity and profits in the past decade, there's also been a major increase in the number of fighters complaining about their pay.
The company is fucking growing and they're implementing other little stupid ass bonuses. $5,000 here, $5,000 there. $50,000, man. We've been stuck on this motherfucker for fucking 20 fucking years.
Now, you've probably seen glamorous headlines of UFC fighters making tens of thousands in just a couple of minutes, and in some cases seconds. But these purses are often reserved for the top 1% of fighters that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The average salary for a UFC fighter in 2021 was around $160,000. Now, at the surface, it may appear that these fighters are in fact well paid. However, that number is greatly skewed when compared to the profits that the organization makes as a whole, and the expenses that are incurred by fighters. You see, being a professional MMA fighter is not cheap. For one, fighters who compete outside their home country are subject to international taxes, which can cost the fighter 10 to 30% of their purse. UFC fighters are also classed as independent contractors, so they pay their taxes at the end of each year, and these taxes can be as high as 30% based on the fighter's total earnings. Fighters obviously need to train, and an 8 to 12 week training camp can cost the fighter between 5 to 10% of their total purse each fight. In addition, most fighters need managers, and their fees can fall between 10 to 20% of their total fight purse. And of course, there are also miscellaneous expenses, such as traveling, accommodation, pre-fight medicals, food, supplements, physical therapy. The list simply goes on. And for many up-and-coming UFC fighters, these expenses are simply too high.
Hey, good morning. Just got done with my morning session. I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about my GoFundMe page that I put up. What this does is it helps me to be able to travel, take care of gym fees. To you guys, I'm working, I'm going to school, I'm training, I'm putting in at least over 65 hours a week in these things, and I want to make this happen. I want to go so far in the UFC, and I cannot do it without you.
There's also been reports that even some ring girls make more than some fighters, with some making up to $70,000 per year, whilst one of the most popular ring girls, Ariane Celeste, making close to $1 million per year. Yet despite calls for better pay, UFC President Dana White believes that low fighter pay isn't a real issue and is all just a creation by the media.
Everybody makes money, everybody makes a living. You know, there are some hard stories, some sad stories. Some guy came into this. You're either fucking good enough to be here or you're not. This is the big leagues. It's like the NFL. You can either last here or you can't last here. But people get paid. People get paid a lot of money.
In fact, Dana White believes that the UFC is comparable to other major sports leagues, such as the NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball. But while these leagues have large minimum contracts and pay their athletes around 50% of their revenue, it's been revealed that the UFC pay their fighters significantly less. You see, the UFC is owned and operated by a promotional company called Zuffa, which is wholly owned by a larger company called Endeavor Group Holdings. In December 2014, a group of current and former MMA fighters, including Brandon Vera, Chung Lee, Nathan Quarry, and John Fitch, filed a class action lawsuit against the UFC and Zuffa after claiming the UFC used improper methods to dominate the market for MMA fighter services, allowing them to pay their fighters less as half as much as they otherwise would have received. During hearings, it was revealed that fighters have received around 17% of the UFC's revenues over the past decade. This is probably why you hear so many fighters requesting performance bonuses and bigger purses after their bouts.
I need that bonus. I didn't get the bonus last fight. I thought I should have. I need it. My son going to school. I got a family at home. We just got a new place. Our other house flooded. Please, please.
Dana, I want some chicken, man. I'm hungry. My mom's birthday just passed. She gotta eat, man.
Dana White, Christmas coming up. I have 3 kids, 50 G's, please, please, man. I have 3 kids. Come on, 50.
Dana, please, $50,000. It's me, no house. It's my dream, new house. Please, UFC!
And it's no secret that professional boxers and even YouTube boxers can make far more than their UFC counterparts, who have the same levels of hype and draw power. So what about sponsorships? Companies across the globe are always on the lookout for popular fighters to represent their brand, and are willing to pay these fighters a substantial amount to do so, in some cases more than what they earn from their fights. But this all changed in 2009. After the UFC introduced a sponsor tax, which charged prospective sponsors a $100,000 flat fee for the right to sponsor fighters that appeared on UFC broadcasts for a 6-month period. This eliminated all small-time sponsors, because they may have been able to pay $1,000 to a fighter, but weren't willing to pay $100,000 to the UFC to only then pay $1,000 to a fighter. Of course, the biggest fighters weren't affected by this tax, since companies were paying these fighters millions to represent their brand. But the smaller mid to lower tier fighters, who rely on sponsorships the most, were the most impacted. Felice Herring, Bec Rawlings, and Carla Esposa were 3 UFC female fighters who were dropped by MMA Apparel because this sponsor was unable to afford this tax. Sponsor and endorsement restrictions got even worse in 2014, as the UFC decided to have Reebok as their main apparel sponsor. The $70 million 6-year contract initially seemed like it would be a great deal for all fighters involved, who were paid a compliance fee for wearing Reebok apparel. Fighters were paid based on the number of their bouts and would earn approximately $2,500 per appearance, with this value increasing with the more fights that they had. But let's just say that many fighters were not thrilled by this new sponsorship, as for many, these payments were a drastic reduction from what they'd been making previously with their own sponsors. Ryan Bader, now fighting in Bellator MMA, said he lost tens of thousands of dollars as he was making close to 6 figures a fight before the Reebok deal. Skipping ahead to 2022 saw the release of the co-branded UFC and Dwayne Johnson's Project Rock sneakers, which was announced as the promotion's new official footwear. Fighters have been required to wear these sneakers, but haven't been paid a penny to do so, and this is because of the way that the UFC's contracts are structured. Regardless of how many new sponsorship deals, logos, and products these fighters have to wear, these are all just viewed as part of the promotion guidelines compliance pay. This setup opens up the UFC for additional sponsorship opportunities and revenue streams down the road, but unfortunately, not really much for fighters.
With this one? These shoes fucking suck. Look at these shoes. They make me put this shit on.
Sponsors, you don't hear that. Guys, back to you.
These shoes.
As mentioned earlier, UFC fighters are classified as independent contractors rather than employees. This grants the UFC the ability to limit their fighters' benefits, such as health insurance, retirement benefits, workers' compensation, workplace protections, and the fighters' ability to unionize. You see, in 1967, the average salary for a professional baseball player was similar to the UFC at around $19,000 a year, which amounts to around $170,000 adjusted for inflation. That same year, the NFL salary was around $8,000, and a typical athlete in the 1960s worked a full-time job in the off-season, but by exercising union power in the late 1960s and early 1970s, these athletes changed how the profits were divided. Today, the minimum salary of a Major League Baseball player is around $560,000, while the NFL pays its athletes no less than $480,000. In terms of health insurance, for years the UFC only formally offered medical benefits to its fighters in its active roster who suffered immediate injuries as a result of fights. This is the reason why some fighters have allegedly gone into their matches with injuries to make it seem as if the injury occurred during the bout, as otherwise the fighter has to pay out of pocket. It was only in 2011 that coverage of injuries during training camps for UFC fighters were added to the company's policy. Nonetheless, the the UFC does not offer a pension plan for its fighters dealing with injuries after they retire from their promotion. What's also interesting is that although the UFC labels its fighters as independent contractors, UFC contracts have exclusivity provisions, meaning the fighter cannot compete in any other MMA organization or even any other sports as a professional whilst under this contract. Since 2014, the UFC has had deals with specific apparel companies to exclusively provide uniforms for all fighters to wear, limiting sponsorship opportunities for its athletes. Scott Coker, CEO of the rival promotion Bellator MMA, stated the following.
Listen, they're independent contractors. How they're forced to wear a uniform to this day still baffles me. It should be against the labor laws or something.
So if fighters don't like the pay, why don't they just leave the UFC? Well, the simple fact is that a lot of these athletes simply don't have anywhere else to turn. Whilst other MMA promotions do exist, they have nowhere near the draw of the UFC. So fighters are locked in due to the fact that there's only really one true promotion. So the question is, are UFC fighters underpaid? Well, whilst it's true that fighters are definitely making more than they did 10 years ago, so is the organization. But it seems as though the gap between fighters and the promotion has only continued to increase over the years. What's your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comment section, and be sure to like, comment and subscribe. Thanks for watching.